Before I begin today's lecture, I just want to quickly remind everyone that the tutorials for this class start next week. So you should at this point all know what your tutorial is and where it's taking place, and make sure that you do attend the tutorials because, as I mentioned last class, you do get a portion of your grade from your tutorial participation. That means that you should do something a little bit more than just attend. You should try your best to participate in the discussions for your own good, of course, as I explained last class, but also by virtue of the fact that you will be rewarded for that by getting a slightly higher grade on that portion of your grade. So make sure that you know what your tutorial is, that you have been signed into a tutorial, and make sure you try to attend as much as possible and to participate as much as possible. If you have not yet been signed into a tutorial, you should find out why that is the case, and you should probably visit the registrar to figure out what the problem is and to have them rectify it. Before I begin today's lecture, let me briefly see whether there's any quick questions about anything that I discussed last class before we move on to new material. If not, if everything is crystal clear, then let me try to pick up where we left off last class. Last class, you might recall that I introduced the topic of global politics by briefly looking at the notion of politics and what we mean by it. And while that might have seemed kind of a strange starting place, what I tried to illustrate is that there are a number of different perspectives on how to understand politics, and that really what you're doing when you start to study international relations, when you start to study international politics, political science as a whole, is that you're you're becoming part of an ongoing debate between different perspectives, between different approaches to try to understand what politics is all about. Essentially, what I'm going to be doing today is to move forward in that debate. We argued in particular with regard to politics that there are two different ways of coming at politics. One is to see politics as primarily a matter of allocation, of the competition between different groups and individuals within a society to try to influence the policy of their state. The other focuses primarily on politics as involving the confrontation between states, the confrontation between different types of societies. In other words, politics is about leaders of different societies coming to some conclusions as to what other societies or what other states pose a threat to their existence and which others they can peacefully coexist with. And insofar as that they face threats, it is their responsibility to their citizens, to their state, to adopt policies to address those threats. The latter interpretation of politics is dominant in the school of thought that we described last class as that of realism. Realism, as I pointed out, sees international politics primarily in terms of the competition between states. Indeed, states are seen as the only real relevant actors. I should qualify that by pointing out that realists are not ignorant folks. They do not ignore the existence of organizations like the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or anything of that sort. All they would suggest is that while these organizations exist and while they are important in many ways, they do not trump the interests of states. States remain the only relevant actors. They remain the only relevant actors because these international organizations exist in large part because they were created by states. And they were created by states insofar as those states that created them felt that these institutions served their interests. And will continue to support them insofar as that they think they continue to serve their interest. But the moment that an international organization no longer serves the interest or is no longer perceived to serve the interest of a state that sponsored it, it will back out of supporting that international organization. And furthermore, and this is a topic that we'll talk about a little bit more in detail today, ultimately, international organizations don't trump the sovereignty of states. They cannot impose their will on states if those states don't agree to cooperate. And as such, ultimately, states remain the dominant actors. Now, that might change over time, as liberals argue that it eventually will. Perhaps at some point in the future, international organizations will start to play a much more powerful role. Will have an independent base of power with which they can challenge the interests of individual states. But so far, we haven't gotten there. So far, we are still very much in what realists call the Westphalian state system, which we will talk about at great length today. International politics regardless of the appearance of order that's created by institutions like international organizations and international law, ultimately is still anarchic. There is no one in control. States are still reliant on themselves for their own security. And they achieve that security and to a certain extent try to maintain stability, in large part through what is often referred to as the balance of power. In other words, states are not constantly at war with one another, but rather try to avoid war by balancing against other states through the formation of alliances, through the amassing of more armaments and things along those lines. The central problem, indeed, for realists is how to avoid war. How to avoid war. But overall, as I pointed out, they tend to be rather pessimistic in their outlook. The other thing that is perhaps somewhat important to mention with regard to realism is their view of the state. They view the state as a central actor and as something that is not reducible to other means, to other interests. In other words, states don't reflect the interests of their citizens or the interests of their major corporations, but rather act in accordance to their own logic. And that logic is determined by the international system in which they have to survive. Liberalism, by contrast, we pointed out, doesn't necessarily reject the description of the international system offered by realists. Liberals are also well aware that war has been with us for many centuries, that it is likely to be with us for many more, that international organizations are not capable of preventing war in the absolute sense, as much as they might try to do so. But they would argue that there's scope for improvement. Essentially, they disagree on certain fundamental things with realists. First and foremost, human nature. They would argue that human nature is by its very nature cooperative, but is corruptible, and indeed is corrupted by the institutions of the international system today. It is corruption of the human spirit, of human nature, that causes humans to become violent. It is corruption that results from the circumstances in which people find themselves. Change the circumstances and people will become more cooperative. The central problem for liberals, therefore, becomes how to encourage that kind of cooperation. And as I tried to point out last class, the main means of doing so in the international system, cooperation between states, involves trade. Trade. The more states trade with each other, the more they are cooperating with each other. The more some states can specialize on things that they produce well and trade those things for things that they don't produce very well. And insofar as that they trade with other states and increase their wealth as a result of that trade by being able to specialize on those things that they produce most effectively, the more they become interdependent with each other. And the more costly it is for that cooperation to break down. In other words, the less likely it becomes for them to make war against each other. A good illustration of that overall orientation of liberals is the formation of the European Union. The European Union began with fairly humble beginnings at the end of the Second World War. And the Second World War was an illustration, if such an illustration was still needed, that war was utterly irrational. That whatever the parties in the Second World War thought that they might have gained by going to war was vastly outweighed by the damage that was done to all participants in that war. Perhaps the only country that actually profited from the Second World War was the United States, in large part because the United States was never actually directly involved in the war. No combat took place on its soil. But all of the other countries that were involved in it, certainly the Europeans and certainly the Asian countries, had a great deal more destruction, and nobody ultimately won from that. And given that this unthinkable level of destruction and the various other perversities that went along with it, like the Holocaust, were something that had to be avoided at all costs, liberals in Europe started to get to work on trying to figure out how to do so. And the first way to do so was to promote trade. And therefore, the European Union had its beginnings, and this is something that we'll discuss in a bit more detail later on in the class, had its beginnings in a very simple organization called the European Coal and Steel Community. The European Coal and Steel Community. which was a trade agreement between France and Britain and 6 other Central European states to pool their coal and steel resources and to create a single industry in regards to coal and steel, rather than have separate industries. And the reason for that, the reason why coal and steel, is because coal and steel were the most crucial ingredients to building a war machine, at least in Europe. Europe doesn't have a heck of a lot of oil, otherwise oil would probably be included in that as well. If France and Germany share a steel industry, they can't make war against each other. And slowly from that, this idea of trade, of codependence, spread and became more and more pronounced until the European coal and steel community became the European Community, which eventually became the European Union. And it's well on its way, or hopefully, so it's hoped by the protagonists of the European Union, for the European Union to become a supranational organization in which the various member states of Europe surrender their sovereignty. In other words, surrender their separate armies, surrender their ability to make their own foreign policies, and pool their resources to become a single community, making war ultimately impossible. Europe is still a long ways from that. And while things look pretty rosy up until a couple of years ago, things don't look so rosy in Europe these days anymore, and whether Europe will ever achieve that is still very much an open question, and the most common answer to that is ultimately, it probably won't. And that's certainly the answer that realists would give. Indeed, realists would point out that there's not a single example in history of states voluntarily surrendering their sovereignty, their independence, to a greater power like the European Union. Insofar as states have lost their independence and have gotten absorbed by larger states, that has always been the result of war and coercion, not a voluntary matter. Another component of liberalism, often referred to as idealism, comes out of the philosophies of Immanuel Kant, another German philosopher, who developed what became known as the democratic peace theory. The democratic peace theory. And essentially, the democratic peace theory rests on a fairly simple observation. It rests on the observation that no two democratically governed countries have ever made a war against each other. Of course, that depends very much on how you define democracy. But there are some obvious reasons why this might be the case. Democracies behave differently than authoritarian states, or so the argument goes. And one reason why they behave differently is because it is not usually the leaders of states that pay a steep cost for conflict, that pay a steep cost by going to war. It is usually the average citizen that bears the brunt of the cost of war, both because the average citizen is recruited into militaries where they risk their lives, and because, especially in the 20th century, as we'll see in a bit more detail later, wars have become enormously destructive, so that they're not limited to battlefields where armies face each other, but involve the entire society. And if that is the case, then it could be expected that the average citizen is going to be very reluctant to endorse a war, because they will have to pay the cost for it. And consequently, is going to put restraints on their government in terms of their, insofar as their governments want to go to war against a neighboring country. Democratic peace theory also has another component to it, and that is, and indeed studies that have tried to test these basic hypotheses have come to the conclusion that democracies may never go to war against each other, but they do tend to go to war against non-democratic states. And on average, democracies go to war as often as non-democracies do, which seems to indicate that they go to war against authoritarian states more often than authoritarian states go to war against each other. The basic idea, therefore, is that similar political regimes are less likely to result in warfare. There's a fairly similar kind of a theory that is often known as the Big Mac theory of international peace. Anyone ever heard of the Big Mac theory of international peace? The Big Mac theory of international peace rests on a similar kind of observation, and that observation is that no two countries, both of which have a McDonald's within their borders, have ever fought a war against each other. democratic peace theory might be a lot more credible than the Big Mac peace theory. But the reason that I mention it is that there's a very big question as to whether there's any causal connection between having a McDonald's and the tendency to go to war, or whether there's any real causal connection between democratic regimes and their tendency to go to war. It might simply be a matter of coincidence. Suffice it to say that much of the liberal perspective has rested on these ideas of democracy and international organization and cooperation as being a means of overcoming the endless return to warfare that human societies have experienced. And one of the best examples of that was the American involvement in the First World War. Woodrow Wilson agreed to participate in the Second World War on behalf of the allies of Great Britain and France on the basis of what he called his 14 points. And I won't bore you with all of the details of those 14 points, but one slogan stood out among those 14 points, and that is that the United States would enter the war to make the world safe for democracy. And indeed, that was the orientation of the Wilson administration. It's concluded essentially that the best way to avoid another war in Europe in particular, since wars tended to take place in Europe, at least the ones that the Americans were concerned with, was to make sure that all European powers were democratic. And the outgrowth of that was that the United States would refuse to accept a negotiation of an armistice between Germany and France and its enemies, so long as Germany still was ruled by the Kaiser, was still under a monarchy. A precondition for entering into any kind of negotiations was that the monarchy abdicate and that Germany be converted to a democracy. And of course, he also emphasized things like international organizations. The first attempt to create international organizations was, as many of you probably know, the League of Nations, which was established at the end of the Second World War, at the end of the First World War, and largely at the behest of the United States. Now, what's interesting in regard to that is that, as I pointed out, liberalism tends to have much stronger roots in North America and in the Anglo-Saxon world, in other words, in Great Britain, where its core philosophers and that outlook tends to dominate, whereas realism tends to dominate in Western Europe. And that was certainly the case at the end of the First World War. The European powers, in particular France, had very much a realist outlook on politics and acted accordingly. And from their perspective, their idea was that since Germany had on 2 occasions attacked the French territory and occupied French territory, first in the Franco-Prussian War and then the First World War, that the best way to make sure that it never does so again is essentially to make sure that Germany never be able to develop the capacities to project power again. And what's the best way of doing that? Well, the best way of doing that is to first and foremost cripple their economy. And crippling their economy was relatively easy. The French declared that the Germans were solely responsible for the outbreak of World War I, and that they had to pay reparations for all of the damages that were caused in foreign territory to those countries. And that essentially precluded Germany investing in its own territory, but Germany was not in a position to make those payments, and therefore France insisted that it get a share of its territory, so it could withdraw those resources from that territory. Basically, they crippled the German economy and to a significant extent reduced the ability of Germany to govern itself. The Americans had a different perspective on this. And their perspective was essentially that the best way to assure stability is to make sure that there was no victor's justice. In other words, that Germany should be set up as a functioning democracy. Ultimately, the Americans lost out in this. And the reparations were imposed on Germany, and consequently Germany went into a tailspin, and while they established a democracy immediately after the First World War, that democracy was extremely weak and collapsed ultimately under the attack of, on the one hand, the communist parties, but most notably, of course, the Nazi Party that took power in Germany in 1933. Let me leave liberalism and realism behind for the moment. And look at some of the more critical perspectives in regard to international relations. And among the most important in that regard are those that fall into the category of Marxist approaches to studying international relations. And in order to understand Marxist approaches to international relations, we have to understand a little bit about Marxism. Karl Marx wrote in the 19th century. He was a German philosopher who eventually left Germany and went into exile in Great Britain and wrote most of his most important books in the British Museum, where there is still a plaque on the seat that he spent most of his life sitting in and writing his various books. And essentially, Marx argued that the defining characteristic of modern societies was capitalism. Capitalism. Indeed, while we today understand Marx to be a severe critic of capitalism, that's somewhat of a distortion. In fact, if you read Marx's writings, Marx was a big fan of capitalism. He called capitalism the great locomotive of history. The great locomotive of history. And the reason why he called capitalism the great locomotive of history has a great deal to do with his understanding of human history. He argued that human history was essentially a process that began with extremely primitive societies, tribal societies, with little or no technological sophistication, which he described as existing in a state of primitive communism. Primitive communism. And what he argued was, essentially, that these societies were extremely egalitarian, as all tribal societies tend to be. Nobody has any more than anyone else, and the reason that no one has more than anyone else is because they are not capable of producing a surplus. In other words, they only produce barely enough to feed and clothe and shelter themselves, and if there's no surplus, there's no room for inequality. There is, from the perspective of Karl Marx, absolute misery. Bare survival in those kinds of conditions. And he argued that human societies had burst into the period of history as he saw it. During this period of primitive communism, there is no history because there is no surplus and therefore there is no change. History begins for Karl Marx the moment that human societies are capable of producing more than they actually need for their daily survival. And he argued that the moment that human societies were capable of doing that, of producing a surplus, all human societies that reached that stage followed a similar pattern. One class or one category of people within those societies usurped that surplus, and the others were required to produce it. In other words, what emerged almost immediately were class societies, inequality. And the first form of those societies that he analyzed were slave-based societies. Slave-based societies are societies in which there's one class of people that produce and one class that does nothing other than to keep track of their slaves. The slaves necessarily produce more than they consume, and whatever they produce in excess of what they require for their basic survival is usurped by the slave owners. And the slave owners can do with that surplus whatever they want. And slave-based societies like ancient Egypt, for example, made some pretty impressive investments with their surplus, but it demonstrated that they could do with their surplus whatever they wanted. They could build pyramids, and building pyramids was certainly an enormous undertaking, requiring an enormous amount of labor. But what were the pyramids for? Did they do anything to benefit Egyptian society, other than to leave impressive monuments for later generations? Well, to Karl Marx, the answer is no. They didn't. They were relatively useless. They were symbolic. They were simply means by which the ruling elites of Egypt flattered themselves because they were essentially forms of burial mounds and so on and so forth. Consequently, these societies were not particularly productive. Certainly they produced enormous monuments, but they didn't produce much human progress. And consequently were replaced by systems that produced somewhat more human progress. And the next stage in that development, according to Karl Marx, were feudal societies. Feudal societies were very similar to slave-based societies. It's just that the organizing principle of a feudal society is different than the organizing principle of a slave-based society. Slave-based societies are based on the ownership of human beings. One class of humans are the owners of slaves, the others are the slaves. The feudal societies are based on the ownership of land. One class of society, the ruling elites, the landed elites, own the land and are able on the basis of that ownership to get those that are required to work the land to give up part of what they produce, their surplus, to support their standard of living. Simply a different means of administering the same kind of a class division. There's a ruling class that exploits the working class, and that exploitation is pretty blatant. And what should also be noted is that in both cases, insofar as state institutions existed, they existed for one purpose and one purpose only. And that was to keep the lower classes in place, and to some extent to keep other slave societies at bay. In other words, political power and economic power were one and the same thing. And he argued that ultimately, feudal societies, like their slave-based counterparts, were also not particularly productive, because the landed elites could do with that surplus whatever they wanted. They could build bigger castles, they could build themselves big churches, they could hire fools to entertain them, and so on and so forth, none of which did the society any good or caused any real progress within society. And indeed, feudal societies, for the most part, did not value progress, did not value change. Change was always a threat within a feudal society. Stability is what they craved. And given that stagnation of feudal societies, it was inevitable, according to Karl Marx, that they would eventually be replaced by a more productive system. And the productive system that to a large extent eclipsed feudalism was capitalism. And capitalism, he argued, is again a class-based system. It simply has a different organizing principle. Instead of being based on the ownership of humans or the ownership of land, capitalism is based on the ownership of capital. The ownership of capital. Now, it gets pretty complicated to define capital, but capital is basically the ownership of wealth, which is used in order to make more wealth. The ownership of factories. Basically, capital is in the form of money, which is invested into creating factories, and those factories hire workers, and those workers produce more than they actually, or are paid less than they actually produce, and the difference is profit. And that profit is usurped by the owners of capital. And consequently, the owners of capital get wealthy, and the rest of the society remains exploited, just as they were exploited in the slave-based system or in a feudal system. And of course, he was writing in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, the same time that Charles Dickens was writing, and consequently, the condition of the working class back in those times was not particularly different or even better than their feudal counterparts as peasants were. So in that sense, he was quite correct that it was an extremely exploitive system. But why was it the great locomotive of history from his perspective? The reason for that is that unlike in a feudal system or in a slave-based system, he argued that in a capitalist system, the ruling class is not free. The ruling class is not free. In other words, the ruling class cannot do with its surplus, with the resources that they extract from their workforce, whatever they want. And the reason for that is because capitalists are permanently in competition with each other in a market system. And the only way that they can survive as capitalists is to stay ahead of their competition. And that means that they have to take that profit and invest a sizable share of that profit on a regular basis to continuously keep themselves efficient, to continuously keep themselves able to compete, competitive. And that in turn means that capitalism is a system that constantly drives innovation, that constantly upgrades the means of production, and therefore becomes the great locomotive of history. It, more than any other kind of a system, revolutionizes the way that human societies produce goods and services. The problem with capitalism, however, he argued, is that it contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. In other words, and again, I'm grossly simplifying because we don't want to spend too much time on this topic, if you imagine an economic system in which there are workers that produce things and capitalists that own factories, and those factories are constantly made more and more efficient. Well, what does it mean to make them more and more efficient? What it means is that they are able to produce more and more goods using less and less labor. In other words, every machine that is invented or improved replaces labor, and consequently cranks out more goods using less labor. Now, what does that do to the system as a whole? Well, basically it means that the demand for labor is continuously declining. And in a market system, the value of goods, of commodities, including labor, is determined by demand. And if the demand for labor continues to decline, the wages will continue to fall. then they can only fall as far as the basic survival needs of the working class, can't starve them all, and that means essentially that the condition of workers ends up not being much better off than their feudal or slave-based counterparts. However, given that that process is ongoing, the working class continues to get larger and larger, and the surplus labor pool likewise gets larger and larger. And that creates certain problems, one of which is that at a certain point, the working class will refuse to take it, will start to organize in a way as to resist their continual immiseration. The other problem is that the capitalist system itself will run into problems. Because what happens if you keep cranking out more and more goods using fewer and fewer workers and paying those workers less and less? Well, what happens is eventually you have no more consumers because nobody has any money to buy anything more than their basic survival needs. And that means capitalism itself starts to come into crisis. And essentially he argued that these kinds of periodic crises will eventually result in the elimination of capitalism and its replacement by a more rational system in which the productivity gains of a capitalist economy are turned to the advantage of the majority of the population. In capitalism, insofar as a factory becomes more efficient, is able to produce something without your labor power, do you benefit from that as a worker? Do they say, okay, you can take longer vacations, work fewer hours? Of course not. You're fired. And consequently, you do not benefit from that progress. Only those that own the factory benefit from that process, progress by raising their profits. A socialist system, he argued, would ultimately replace this as a result of a revolution. And a socialist system will simply allow the working class that produced all of these goods to seize the means of production and to put them to the use of the public as a whole, rather than simply for the benefit of the owners of that capital. Now, that's Marxism in a nutshell, and a fairly small nutshell, and for those of you interested in it or whose interest is piqued by this, you should certainly investigate it in more detail. I've been painting with a very broad brush and there's a lot more to it. Suffice it to say, however, that none of this in the immediate sense relates to international relations. And to update Marxism and make it relevant to international relations, essentially a couple of schools of thought emerged that were inspired by Marxism and that applied the lessons of Marxism to an understanding of international politics. Those schools are often referred to as the dependency school or the world systems theory, and there are significant overlaps between the two. The dependency school basically argued that if you look at the international system as a whole, it is divided in the same way that class societies are divided internally. In other words, there are the wealthy and there are the poor, and the poor are the vast majority on the planet. The wealthy tend to be concentrated in the North and Western Europe and North America, and much of the rest of the world is poor, is underdeveloped or undeveloped. And dependency argued, basically, that this is no accident. Essentially, they argued that the idea that is often put forward by sociologists in the West and so on, that all societies develop through stages, that they begin as tribal societies, eventually achieve some kind of an agricultural base, then eventually develop industries, and then eventually become modern industrialized capitalist states and so on, is entirely false. All states do not go to those stages. And it is not true that the poor countries, the less developed countries in the world, are simply further behind their modern counterparts. In fact, what the dependency school argued is that the development of the first world and what they call the underdevelopment of the third world are flip sides of the same coin. That the first world, to a large extent, developed at the expense of the third world. And the key ingredient in that regard is imperialism and colonialism. Imperialism and colonialism allowed the countries of Western Europe to seize the resources of much of the rest of the world and to use those in order to develop their economies. As such, what emerged was not separate states at different states of development, but rather a world system, a world division of labor. and thus world systems theory. And as Immanuel Wallerstein put it so eloquently, in a world system, states are not at different stages of development. They are part of a system, and they have different functions within that system. And the function of the dependent states, the states in the periphery in the third world, is to supply that system primarily with raw materials, or with goods that can be produced with very cheap, unskilled labor. The role of intermediate states is to supply them with more advanced kinds of manufactured goods. And the role of the core countries is essentially that of exploiters of the rest of the world. And he put it quite nicely that he argued that the idea that a country like Bangladesh is simply further behind the countries of Western Europe and will eventually catch up and will eventually become just like Great Britain or just like Germany is nonsense. It is essentially akin to arguing that my liver is less developed than my brain because it has yet to develop the capacity for independent thought. Well, of course, my liver will never develop the capacity for independent thought because that's not its function. And in that sense, Bangladesh will never become Great Britain unless there is some revolutionary change to overthrow this class-based system in the international system. From the point of view of the various characteristics that we described with regard to liberalism and realism, realists argued that human nature is for the most part evil, acquisitive, greedy, and so on and so forth. Liberals tended to argue that humans tend to be good and cooperative, but are corruptible. Marxists argue that humans don't really have a nature, that their nature is determined by the circumstances in which they find themselves. Man has not a nature, but a history. And consequently, while we are currently in a system that encourages greed and selfishness and individualism under a capitalist system, that is not a permanent feature of human societies, that humans are just as capable of being cooperative if they are put into an environment, such as a socialist state, where cooperative behavior is rewarded and encouraged. Now, one other thing that I wanted to say about these three different schools of thought, again, in terms of the motives, greed and power are the main motives for the ruling classes, and liberation and justice, the motives of the lower classes, as well as of the third world. The outlook is pessimism in the absence of revolution. The only thing that can ultimately solve the problems of capitalism internally as well as internationally is some kind of a revolution to eliminate capitalism as a system. And their policy recommendations are to promote revolutionary change. One thing that is unique in this regard that I should mention at this point is that they also all have rather different interpretations or understandings of the state. Liberals and Marxists in that regard are fairly similar in their understanding of the state. And I should point out that when I talk about the state, and we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a few minutes, the idea of the state should be distinguished from the idea of government. Governments are those small groups, those elites that control a particular state, and governments come and go. But states are the permanent entities, the permanent institutions that survive governments. And much theorization has gone into the nature of those states. For the most part, there are a number of different views of states. Marxists and liberals tend to see the state as a dependent variable. And let me briefly explain what I mean by that, for those of you that aren't familiar with scientific lingo. A dependent variable is the thing that is being acted upon. An independent variable is the thing that is doing the action. And essentially, in order to explain the actions of the state, liberals and Marxists don't look to the state itself, but they look at those forces that act upon the state. From the liberal perspective, therefore, the state does what it does because the state is a neutral arena within which competition takes place. And this is something that we intuitively understand in countries like Canada, where we see the state, the institutions of the state, as the arena within which elections and things and lobbying and so on and so forth take place, in which various groups within society try to influence the policy of the state by voting, by calling up their representatives, by holding demonstrations, and various other things in order to influence policy. If you want to understand the policy, what you have to look at, or the reasons why a particular state adopts certain policies, you don't look at the state itself, but you look at the forces that act upon it. In other words, who won the last elections, who held the biggest demonstrations, and so on and so forth. Those are the things that shape policy. The state itself is neutral. And for the most part, liberals tend to see the state as a kind of a social contract. And indeed, liberal political theorists put a great deal of emphasis on this notion of a social contract. A social contract which in some cases can be explicit, such as in the Magna Carta, which is a kind of a contract between the government of Great Britain that defines what the limits of government power are, the kinds of things that the government can get away with and the kinds of things that it cannot get away with. So for example, the state cannot get away with arresting you without charging you. That's what's called habeas corpus. It has to present you with the charges against you and give you an opportunity to contest those charges in a trial and so on. That's part of that basic social contract. In the United States, that basic social contract is seen as the US Constitution, which sets up the institutions of Congress, the executive branch, and the judiciary within which political competition takes place. And what policies are adopted is seen as the result of those political competitions, elections, and so on and so forth. In other states, that social contract is somewhat more hypothetical in that there isn't an actual social contract, but merely an implicit one that regulates the behavior of states. Marxists tend to see things in similar ways, but in many ways in very different ways. Essentially, Marxists likewise see the state as a dependent variable. The state is not the important thing. The state is a tool that is being used by outside forces to achieve their goals. And whose tool is the state? Is it a neutral set of institutions within which competition takes place?
People's tool?
Pardon me?
People's tool?
Which people? All the people?
People that are like the minister?
Yes, that would be the liberal perspective. The Marxist perspective is that...
The higher power.
Exactly. The ruling classes. The state is the tool of the ruling classes. And they would argue that this was the case, certainly and unambiguously, in a slave-based society. Insofar as state institutions existed, things like military forces and so on, they were in the hands of the slave owners, and they were primarily used in order to keep the slaves in their place. That's certainly the case in feudal societies. In feudal societies, those that had economic power and those that had political power were the same people, were the ruling elites, were the landed elites. And they used whatever institutions existed in the form of police forces and so on in order to make sure that the peasants didn't get out of hand. To make sure that some peasant doesn't get the brilliant idea, hey, I don't really like being a peasant. I'd rather be one of the nobles, and I want to achieve that. Well, to encourage upward mobility was seen as subversive in a feudal society. And people that didn't accept their place in society usually met rather ugly ends in feudal societies. In that sense, unambiguously, the state was in the control of the ruling elites. Well, Marxists argue the same thing is true with regard to capitalism. They argue that capitalist states are ultimately the tools of the ruling elites, of the capitalists. And they come to that conclusion by a number of different means. One interpretation is what's often referred to as an instrumentalist view of the state, in which theorists like C. Wright Mills and Ralph Miliband wrote about the connections between the elites that govern the private sector and the elites that govern the public sector, in other words, the state. And noticed that those that are at the highest levels of state bureaucracies and so on tend to be very similar to those that are at the highest levels of the corporate ladder. They tend to come from similar social backgrounds, they tend to have attended the same kind of universities, be members of the same kind of social organizations and clubs and so on. And furthermore, they tend to trade places on a regular basis. People move from being a CEO of a major corporation to becoming a minister in a government or a member of the bureaucracy. And once they finish that job, they move back into the private sector again. They trade places on a regular basis. And given that there's these close social connections between the elites in the state and the elites in the private sector, it's only to be expected that the elites in the state tend to look out for the interests of the elites in the private sector. Other Marxists have kind of rejected that theory and argued that it doesn't really work that way. Certainly the state is a tool of the dominant elites, but not because of their close personal connections, but rather because the state depends on the capitalist economy. It's the structural ties between the capitalist economy and the state that means that the state always has to defend the interests of the dominant elites. And why is that? Well, the easiest way to explain that is if you imagine for a moment that, not that I'm saying that it's impossible, but that Bernie Sanders wins the elections this year in the United States. Now, Bernie Sanders is a self-declared socialist and has promised that he's going to break up the banks, that he's going to impose very strict environmental regulations on dangerous corporations, and that he's going to do a whole slew of other things that he hasn't quite spelled out yet. Now, what do you think will happen on November 4th of this year if Bernie Sanders wins the elections? The elections take place on November 3rd. Well, I would suggest that what will happen on November 4th, the first thing that will happen is that Wall Street will take a big dip. And why will it take a big dip? Because capitalists, on a regular basis, have to invest their monies. And those investment decisions take place to a large extent on Wall Street, in terms of where capitalists are going to put their money. And when they want to invest in something, they want to invest in something that is sure to make them a profit. And the way that they can make sure that it's going to make them a profit is that they sit down and figure out, okay, if I'm going to invest in a company that makes cars, for example, I invest so and so much money, and it costs so and so much to produce vehicles, and they can be sold at such and such a price, and that gives me a plentiful margin of profit, 20% or something along those lines, and therefore I can invest my money and be sure that I'm going to make a profit, and be sure that my money is safe. Now, what happens when somebody like Bernie Sanders comes in and says, well, actually, I'm going to change all the rules. I'm going to increase taxes, I'm going to impose various regulations, and so on and so forth. Well, what happens is that capitalists suddenly can't make those calculations anymore because they don't know what their costs of production are going to be. And that, in turn, means that they're going to hold on to their money until they do have some guarantees. And what happens when the capitalists hold on to their money? Don't invest it. Don't build the factories. Well, obviously, the economy slows down. And as the economy slows down, unemployment goes up. And as unemployment goes up, simultaneously, the tax income to the state goes down. And that means that Bernie Sanders is going to suddenly sit in the White House and go, how the heck are we going to pay our bills? And once he comes to that realization, he'll realize that the only way out of it is to figure out some way to get the capitalists to reinvest their money. And therefore get the unemployment figures down and get the tax income of the state back up. And how is he going to do that? He's going to do that by essentially saying, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to break up the banks, and don't worry, I'm not going to impose drastic regulations and so on and so forth. And it's one of the reasons why reformist governments that are elected in capitalist states are often rather disappointing to those that supported them, because they ultimately have to back off of their various campaign promises. The reason for that is because the state is structurally tied to the capitalist economy. It cannot function unless the capitalist economy functions, unless people invest their money. Realists, of course, don't agree with that either. Realists ultimately argue on the basis of historical evidence that states are independent variables that cannot be reduced to the interests of other actors. And the reason that I make so much of this point is that it gives you somewhat of an understanding of why liberals tend to be optimistic about the future and realists tend to be rather pessimistic about the future. If the actions of states are a reflection of the interests of the dominant elites, then it makes sense that as those dominant elites become more and more involved with each other across borders through trade and so on and so forth, they will put pressure on the state in order to defend that relationship, to maintain that relationship, to maintain those profits. And therefore states can be socialized into becoming more and more integrated into a larger structure. If states are independent variables, then you can't put pressure on them. Then states function by their own logic. And that's the argument that realists ultimately make. And realists make that argument on the basis primarily of the history of the emergence of states, a topic we're going to take up in about 2 minutes. Before I do so, however, I also want to briefly mention two other approaches that can be characterized as critical approaches to international relations. One is the growing role of environmentalism. I won't say too much about it because we're going to take that topic up later on in the class and have a lecture on the environmental challenges faced by the international system. And we'll look at environmentalism in more detail in that regard. Suffice it to say that environmentalists offer substantial critiques of the other approaches, but have never articulated a complete theory of international relations in the way that realism and liberalism and Marxism have. The same thing is to a large extent true for feminism. Feminism has offered some valuable critiques of international relations theory, in particular of realism. Realism has often been described as a kind of a theory on testosterone-based theory or something along those lines because of all of its machismo. And they ultimately argue that gender differences are reflected in these kinds of approaches. And indeed, that one of the main problems of the international system is the subsidiary role that women play within that overall system. It's overwhelmingly a male-dominated system. And many feminists argue that men and women are epistemologically and in every other way entirely different in terms of their nature. And thus, if women were more empowered within the nation state, within the international system, it would bring about a more peaceful and more cooperative kind of international environment. Again, many of these critiques, and certainly the critiques of globalization that we'll see in a bit more detail that are offered by feminists, are very insightful and very important. But feminism does not generally offer a comprehensive theory of international relations the way that realism and liberalism do. So let's turn our attention now to the emergence of states and the emergence of what has become known as the Westphalian state system. The Westphalian state system. It's called the Westphalian state system for a very simple reason. In 1648, a peace treaty was signed in the city of Münster in Westphalia. Westphalia is a region of what today is Germany, central Germany. Münster is one of the oldest cities in it. And that treaty brought an end to a extremely bloody war, generally known as the 30 Years' War. And that 30 Years' War was fought primarily between various monarchs and various nobles and the Catholic Church. In other words, it was a war between Protestants and Catholics. And essentially, to understand that war, you have to understand a little bit about the history of the Catholic Church and the Reformation. Basically, the Catholic Church monopolized political power throughout most of what are usually referred to as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages in Western Europe, the period from the decline of the Roman Empire until the Enlightenment. The Reformation broke that monopoly, and it broke that monopoly on the basis of several priests and monks and so on that were able to read the Bible. The Bible was never translated out of Latin, and consequently most Europeans could never read the Bible. Only those that spoke Latin could, and only those that learned Latin in monasteries and became priests and so on had access to the Bible. And consequently, the means of maintaining the doctrine of the Catholic Church depended on the cooperation of its clergy. And some of that clergy was more independently minded and read the Bible and noticed that there were aspects of the Bible that didn't seem to be in keeping with the Catholic interpretation of that text or with the behavior of the Catholic Church, and therefore started to criticize it. I don't want to go into theological discussions about that. That's not particularly important. Suffice it to say that these kinds of challenges to Catholic teaching arose on a number of occasions. One of the most important, of course, was the challenge that was put forward by Galileo. Galileo looked through telescopes and so on and noticed that the description of the heavens that was offered in the Bible didn't seem to coincide with what he was observing through his telescope. And concluded that seeing is believing, and that what he was seeing through his telescope was therefore right, and what the Bible contained was therefore had to be wrong. Anyone know what happened to him? let's just say it didn't help his career. In other words, he was pretty quickly suppressed, and Galileo was relatively lucky. He was under house arrest. Most others that followed similar, that questioned the faith, meant much uglier ends, and consequently, little in the way of progress occurred throughout the Middle Ages. It started to occur when a few priests, such as Martin Luther and Calvin and so on, again, questioned the teachings of the church in a number of ways. And the reason they didn't get their heads lopped off for doing so was in large part because their protests against the church coincided with growing resentment on the part of nobles in Northern Europe against the exploitation of their resources by the Catholic Church. In other words, they didn't want to be answering to the Catholic Church. They didn't want to have to regularly pay tribute to the Catholic Church. And one way of avoiding that was to slip out from under. And consequently, they supported Martin Luther and Calvin and so on in their rebellion against the Catholic Church, which resulted in the 30 Years' War, which was a war between Catholics and Protestants. And it never came to an actual end. It went on and on and on for 30 years. And during that 30 years, it's estimated that 2/3 of the population of what today is Germany lost their lives. In other words, it was an extremely bloody conflict. And eventually, the various elites involved in that came to the conclusion, we got to end this somehow. And they met in Münster and agreed that the best way to end the conflict was to declare that the religion of the king is the religion of the people. In other words, that whatever the noble person in a particular district decided was their religion, whether it was Catholicism or Protestantism, was going to be the religion of their subjects, of those that they ruled over. That's somewhat problematic because, of course, it has nothing to do with the beliefs of the general public. The public wasn't asked, would you like to be a Protestant or would you like to be Catholic? They were told by their nobles, you are going to be Protestant. The upshot of that is still to some extent felt in Germany. So throughout the 20th century, for example, 90% of all Germans continue to self-identify as either Catholics or Protestants. But only about 30% of Germans believe in God. Go figure. In other words, those affiliations became more labels than really significant of their beliefs. But that's another matter. The reason that this Peace of Westphalia was important is because it created the institution of sovereignty. In essence, that the ruler, the king, the nobleman or whatever, was the ultimate authority within his territory and could rule over everything else and was free from the outside interference within that territory by other states. And that became the crucial building block of the state system. Now, in order to understand that, we first of all have to very quickly look at what a state actually is. A state has a number of different characteristics. Now, much of this might seem obvious, but it's not as obvious as you might think. And indeed, the fact that we currently are witnessing the claim of an Islamic state to statehood demonstrates that there is considerable debate about what actually constitutes a state. Those believers in the Islamic State and Daesh or whatever you want to call it see themselves very much as operating a state within the international system. Most of the rest of the world doesn't seem to want to accept that. I'm not going to give you an answer as to which of those is right, but let's take a look at the nature of states and come to our own conclusions with regard to that. Well, the first thing that states that characterizes states is that they occupy a defined territory. They occupy a defined territory. Now, again, that would seem to be almost obvious. But one thing that I should point out is that states, in that kind of an understanding, are relatively recent inventions, have really only been around for about 500 years. Prior to that, certainly there were organizations that looked a little bit like states, but they didn't function like modern states. And they certainly didn't have a defined territory. In other words, prior to the Peace of Westphalia, usually the way that politics operated is that there were centers of power, usually big cities. And those centers of power exercised control over the hinterland around them, and certainly exercised considerable control over those areas immediately adjacent to those cities. But as you got further and further away from those centers of power, their ability to collect taxes, their ability to administer things declined. And ultimately, there were zones between centers of power where the claims to power conflicted. In other words, where neighboring centers of power claimed the same territory and claimed authority over the same areas as their neighbors did. There were not agreed upon boundaries between those entities. States in this regard are relatively recent developments. And there are things that we tend to take for granted. In fact, we go further than taking them for granted. We tend to see the emergence of states and the existence of states as a great achievement in human history. We like living in states. States provide us with order. States provide us with stability. They provide us with security, and so on and so forth. And we tend to view those that are not living in states as unfortunate. That's, however, not really how human societies develop. For the most part, humans have existed for 99.9% of their existence on this planet outside of states. And insofar as those living outside of states saw the rise of states, they tended to see them as disastrous. One reason for that is that the first states that arose were slave states, and consequently becoming incorporated into a state generally meant becoming a slave in that state. And consequently, they fought against being incorporated into states tooth and nail, and often to their death. And that continues to go on to this very day in the few regions of the world where there are still tribes that live outside of state authorities or state boundaries. But those are becoming fewer and fewer. If you're interested in some of that, one of the best books on the state as a whole and on the relationship between state and statelessness is by a fellow by the name of James C. Scott, who teaches political science at Harvard University. And he wrote two very influential books. One is Thinking Like a State, that explores the logic of states, and the other is The Art of Not Being Governed, which is a long study of tribal societies in various parts of the world, primarily in Southeast Asia, that continue to live outside of the control of states. But that's another matter. So they occupy a defined territory, something that is relatively recent. Secondly, they possess a permanent population. And again, possessing a permanent population is something that we take for granted these days. We are citizens of Canada, or France, or Germany, or whatever the case may be. And as such, all states have a permanent population. But that, again, runs counter to aspects of human nature. Most human societies, or most of human history, have been nomads. In other words, they've traveled over long distances of land following, as the natives in northern Canada still do, things like the caribou or various other resources that move from place to place. Sedentary populations really only emerged with agriculture, which only emerged a couple of thousand years ago. For the vast majority of human society, people lived outside of states and were for the most part nomadic. And states to this day have problems with nomads. It is one of the reasons why the Roma have continuously had problems in Western Europe, in large part because the Roma, also derogatorily known as gypsies, tend to be nomads. In other words, they move from place to place. And that in turn means that there are problems for countries in which they are not citizens and in which they are often not welcome. A third characteristic is sovereignty. Sovereignty. We already talked about sovereignty. Sovereignty essentially means that a state is free from the interference by other states in its internal affairs. Now, are states ever completely free from interference in their internal affairs by neighboring states? The answer to that is, of course, not. But officially, they are supposed to be. The reason that they're not is because states spy on each other. In other words, they have secret services and spy agencies and things along those lines that clandestinely try to interfere in the affairs of foreign powers. But for the most part, sovereignty, therefore, is something that is achieved by states, that is aimed for by states, but that is never completely achieved. No state is ever completely sovereign, but they are more or less sovereign. And, of course, the more powerful states tend to be more sovereign, and the weaker a state is, the more it is subject to interference in its internal affairs by other more powerful states. A fourth characteristic is diplomatic recognition. Diplomatic recognition. Now, diplomacy derived not so much from the Peace of Westphalia that was signed in 1648, but rather from a subsequent treaty signed in Utrecht. You don't have to memorize all of those things or all those names. That set up the institution of diplomacy. And the institution of diplomacy is, again, something of a unique invention that for the most part emerged out of Western Europe, and emerged out of Western Europe because of the constant warfare that was going on in Western Europe, and the enormous costs that it imposed on societies of Western Europe. How do you stop warfare? Well, one way of stopping warfare, probably the only way of stopping warfare, is negotiation. But negotiation is difficult when you're in a war. You send somebody across the battle lines to talk to the leader on the other side, what's the most likely outcome? They'll get shot as soon as they get within firing range. And that will end the negotiation, and consequently, the war will come to an end once one side is unambiguously victorious, which may never occur. And therefore, to overcome constant warfare, you had to institute some means by which you could negotiate. And the means of doing so was to negotiate the idea of diplomatic immunity. In other words, that states are recognized by their neighbors and can send representatives that are immune from that kind of treatment to negotiate on behalf of their government and that will be free from interference in their attempts to do so. So diplomacy becomes a very important component of the relations between states. The last characteristic of states is perhaps the most important. And again, if we look at these various characteristics, states occupy defined territory. Does the Islamic State occupy defined territory? Not quite. In other words, they're still attempting to spread their territory, but they do have some territory. So to a certain extent, it meets that requirement. Secondly, do they possess a permanent population? Well, it could be argued that they do, insofar as that they occupy the Sunni heartland in the regions of Syria and Iraq, the Sunni population of both of those countries tends not to see itself as having a secure existence in the former states of Iraq or Syria, both of which are currently being governed by Shiite governments or dominated by Shiites. So in that sense, they probably do have a permanent population. Are they sovereign? Probably not. Quite clearly, there are a number of other states that don't recognize them and that are actively trying to interfere within their own territory by bombing them, among other things. Are they diplomatically recognized? Absolutely not. And this is one of the main problems with the Islamic State, and one of the reasons why the conflict is so difficult to bring to an end. Who do we negotiate with if we wanted to settle with the Islamic State? If we wanted to say, hey, okay, you've captured that territory, we might not like you, but we want this war to end. Well, we don't know who to talk to. There is no official government or no diplomatic recognition that would facilitate that, at least not yet. The last characteristic, and the one that I've underlined because it is perhaps the most important, is that states possess a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence, both within and outside of their territory. States possess a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence, both within and outside of their territory. The important thing to point out in this regard is that states, of course, do not monopolize the ability to use coercion, violence, or force within their territories, but insofar as force, coercion, or violence are used within that territory without state authorization, it is not legitimate. In other words, it's considered a crime and is therefore prosecuted by the state as a crime. States are the only ones that are able to coerce, or those that are authorized by the state in the form of police forces and so on, are the only ones that are legitimately allowed to coerce and to use violence against their own citizens. And this is an important point, and is an important point that is worth considering in terms of looking at actual states in the international system. Certainly, in a country like Canada, Canada is pretty successful at monopolizing the use of force, coercion, and violence within its territory. We don't have citizens with private armies. We don't have insurgencies or guerrilla movements trying to carve out a little statelet for themselves somewhere in Canadian territory. In that sense, we are in a state that has achieved that component of statehood. But most other states in the international system have achieved that degree of statehood only to a degree, some more so than others. Most in the developed world are able to exercise a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence, whereas those in the developing world and in the regions in between tend to have far more problems in regard to that. And there's important reasons for that. In other words, we are seeing a number of places around the world where there are uprisings, regional rebellions, coups and things along those lines, all of which indicate that there are private citizens able to exercise violence and coercion. A good example of that is Mexico. El Chapo has his own private army and has his own, he's in jail now, and that's part of the process of Mexico re-achieving that monopoly of force, coercion, and violence. But Mexico does not enjoy that, and many consider Mexico, for that reason, to be on the verge of being a failed state, insofar as it has not been able to monopolize the use of force, coercion, and violence within its territory. There are a number of different militias that operate within it. The same thing is true in many Latin American countries, and is in particular true in many African and Southeast Asian countries as well, for reasons that we'll explore in a few minutes. So how did states come into being? We talked a little bit about states coming into being through a social contract. Realists, for the most part, reject the idea that states came into existence through a social contract. We can see examples of a social contract as the origin of a state, really only in situations like Great Britain and the United States, and even there it is debatable how important those documents were in the creation of those states. Primarily, as realists have argued, and the reason why realists argue that states are independent variables, is that states have come into existence through what is often referred to as a extraction coercion cycle. And one of the best examples to illustrate that extraction coercion cycle was the emergence of the Prussian state. The Prussian state ultimately became the dominant state within the region that is now Germany, and unified Germany under its control. In other words, incorporated all of the other principalities of modern Germany into its control. And it had its start back in 1640, sort of around the time that the Peace of Westphalia was signed. At that point, Frederick William ruled the tiny Principality of Prussia with his control over 1,300 mercenaries. He had no real administration, and he had no real bureaucracy. He only had these 1,300 mercenaries. And he used those 1,300 mercenaries to get access to resources. Now, how do mercenaries get access to resources? Pardon me? Well, you can't really still call it stealing if they're authorized by the king to do so, but yes, in effect, that's right. Basically, Frederick William pointed at a village and said, "Go get what you can and bring it to me." And they plundered it and stripped it bare, and he used those resources basically that he derived from those 1,300 mercenaries that had control over a fairly small patch of land to raise a larger army, to hire more mercenaries. And then he used those additional mercenaries to take control over more territory. And he used that larger territory in order to extract more resources. And then he used those resources to hire yet more mercenaries. And used those mercenaries again to expand his territory, and so on and so forth. At a certain point, however, he would have come to the realization that this didn't work out all that well. Basically, he would have come to the realization that many of us would come to fairly quickly, that he can only plunder a village once. In other words, that if you send the mercenaries into a village, they will remove everything that they can carry from that village and kill a lot of the village in the process. It's going to take 20, 30, 40 years before that village is worth plundering again. And in the meantime, you don't have access to any resources, unless you capture more territory, but eventually that becomes a rather weak means of maintaining yourself. Consequently, he would have come to the conclusion that rather than plundering villages, it's better to let those villages exist and protect those villages, and simply collect whatever surplus those villages are capable of producing. Now, to do that, you can't have mercenaries simply raid the village and take whatever they want. You need some means of administering that, of calculating what the village needs to survive and to go on producing, and what is a surplus that can be taxed and therefore removed. In other words, you need some kind of administration. The other thing that he would have very quickly realized is that mercenaries are loyal to the king only insofar as the king provides them with resources to enrich themselves. And their loyalty doesn't extend any further than that. In fact, mercenaries generally are professional soldiers, and they rarely have an interest in dying in a war. As such, many of the medieval wars that were fought between different mercenary armies had very few casualties. One extensive battle that was studied by a historian came to the conclusion that there were only three casualties in this confrontation between armies numbering in the thousands. And those three casualties died from drowning in the mud because they were trampled on when the army advanced, not from actual combat. If you're a professional soldier that's doing it for the money, you're not willing to die. If you're, however, a professional soldier that is tied directly to the state, your loyalty can be much more easily depended upon. And consequently, by 1688, Brandenburg Prussia, much more formidable creation, at that point had a standing army of 30,000, directly employed by Frederick William, and had a fairly extensive administrative set of organizations for the purposes of collecting taxes. By the time that Frederick William died and the throne was inherited by his son Frederick William I, the King of Prussia, the standing army had the size of 80,000 and had a fairly extensive bureaucracy and had a fairly advanced system of tax collection. Now that's a model of how a state came into existence. But what you can also probably imagine is that when Frederick William started this process in Prussia, that it had impacts on neighboring regions. That neighboring regions saw the rise of Prussia and were consequently very quickly faced with a choice. That choice was either to imitate what Frederick William was doing in order to create their own state institutions and therefore protect themselves from Prussia, or to get gobbled up by Prussia. Meaning that states from the beginning arose in competition with each other. And it's the threat that one state posed to the other that stimulated and accelerated that overall process of state making. For that reason, realists essentially argue that states are independent variables, that states organize in accordance to their own logic, and that logic is based on that extraction-coercion cycle. A somewhat more sophisticated version of that was offered by Charles Tilly in a groundbreaking article called War Making and State Making as Organized Crime. In that he argues that the formation of states in Western Europe was essentially very much analogous to what is generally known as a protection racket. A protection racket. Do you all know what's meant by a protection racket? Well, for those of you that don't, a very easy example of that that I encountered in my travels was I was traveling with my girlfriend in Jamaica several years back, and we wanted to rent a motorbike to go and visit these caves up in the hills. And so I rented this motorbike, and we got on the motorbike and buzzed up into the hills. And these caves were in a completely desolate area. There's nobody visible anywhere around. And as soon as we pulled up to the caves, suddenly all these little kids came running up out of the woods and ran up and said, "Hey, we'll watch your motorbike for you while you're in the cave if you give us $5." And I'm looking around, going, "Well, what's going to happen to my motorbike? There's nobody around." And then suddenly it dawned on me, well, nothing's going to happen to my motorbike except that all the air will go out of the tires, because these kids will let all the air out of the tires if I don't give them $5. In other words, the offer of protection came from the same people that also posed a threat. And in that regard, Charles Tilly argues that states essentially started the same way. They also promoted themselves to their future citizens on the basis of offering protection. We're going to collect some resources from you. If you pay us those resources, those taxes, then we'll protect you from this power that's over the other side of the hill that otherwise might attack you. Now, what would happen if you didn't pay your taxes? Would you get attacked by the other power? No, you'd get attacked by the tax collectors. In other words, the threat came from the same folks that offered the protection. In that regard, he argues that states emerged out of a process that included 4 different characteristics. One was war making. In other words, that states have to eliminate or neutralize the external wielders of power. They're always in competition with each other.
Secondly, what he called state making. And state making involves eliminating or neutralizing domestic wielders of power that could threaten your position as a particular ruler. In that regard, again, armies became very problematic. Armies were put together, organized by rulers, in essence to protect themselves from neighboring countries or neighboring states, and to a certain extent to protect themselves from domestic opponents. But what's the problem with armies? Well, as soon as you have a very powerful army, the leader of that army becomes the most likely to overthrow your own government. In other words, the threat also can be directed at whoever is in charge of the military. And for that reason, essentially, states have developed various crafty means of preventing that. The main means of preventing that is to separate police forces from military forces. In other words, police forces are those forces that are capable of maintaining domestic order, but not powerful enough to pose a threat to the existing government or the existing state. Whereas militaries are designed primarily to project power outward, and therefore don't have the power to overthrow the government in charge of the state. That tends to be the case in Western Europe, in particular, in North America, but there are, of course, numerous countries around the world in which military coups are still fairly regular. And among those regions where military coups have been most regular, in the 20th century at least, was Latin America. And Latin America is kind of unique in that regard, as we'll see in a few minutes, when we look at how the state system spread around the world. The third characteristic is protection. Or the third process, rather, that produces states is protection. And that means essentially eliminating or neutralizing the competitors of clients within or outside of the territory. And lastly, extraction. Extraction refers simply to the raising or getting the resources needed in order to perform the above functions. Now, as we pointed out, the state system emerged out of the Peace of Westphalia. And the Peace of Westphalia essentially established states within Western Europe. But it doesn't explain how states became the dominant feature of the global system as a whole. In order to understand that, we have to take a look at what spread that system of states to other parts of the world where states previously did not exist, at least not in the way that we define them. And the most important factor that spread that state system to other parts of the world is colonialism. Colonialism. Now let me talk a little bit about colonialism. Colonialism, and again, we could spend hours and probably weeks discussing and analyzing colonialism and its history. But for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to paint with a very broad brush and make it very quick. And consequently, I will simply explain it in accordance to the way that Immanuel Wallerstein, one of the founders of the School of World Systems Theory, explained colonialism. He argued that colonialism was essentially the search by European states for regions rich enough to be exploited and weak enough to be conquered or dominated. And that process started simply with merchants. Merchants in Europe, in the trading cities of Italy, like Naples and so on, seeking out places where they could make major profits by exporting things from Europe and trading them for things that were in short supply in Europe. Things like spices, like silks, and so on and so forth. And of course, they sent ships to various parts of the world, in particular to East Asia, where they discovered enormous wealth in regard to spices, textiles, and so on and so forth, and made enormous fortunes trading with these regions and supplying the nobility within Western Europe with things like spices, luxury goods like spices, and textiles. Colonialism ultimately emerged out of that. When these greedy folks in Europe decided that they could make a bigger profit if they could cut the cost of transportation. And the costs of transportation were enormous because sailing from the Mediterranean required sailing down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, then up the African coast, and then across the Indian Ocean to places like India and ultimately the Spice Islands and eventually China. And that imposed enormous costs. And of course, most of you know this story, they eventually figured out that the world was round and that therefore they could take a shortcut the other way around. And in trying to take that shortcut, the residents of the Western Hemisphere in 1492 discovered Columbus on their shores. It's kind of odd to say that Columbus discovered the Americas when there were already hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people living there. But suffice it to say that in doing so, the Spanish and the Portuguese that had been the main promoters of that voyage hit the jackpot. The problem with the regions that they contacted in East Asia was that they were certainly wealthy enough to be exploited, but they weren't easy to dominate. They weren't easy to dominate or exploit, in large part because they were highly developed societies. In many ways, what existed in India and China was much more sophisticated at that time than what existed in Western Europe. Western Europeans were relatively primitive by comparison. Furthermore, the long distances between Europe and Asia made actually capturing territory in Asia pretty difficult to do. Doesn't mean that the Europeans didn't try, but they didn't succeed, at least not to the extent that they did in Western Europe, in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere was, on the one hand, enormously wealthy. There was enormous supplies of gold and silver, evident in particular in Central America and in the Andes and the Inca territory. And it was weak enough to be exploited and dominated. Now, why was it weak enough to be exploited and dominated? Well, the best answer to that was offered by Jared Diamond in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, in which he argued that the main advantage that the Europeans had in the Western Hemisphere wasn't their armaments. Certainly, they had guns and things along those lines that were more sophisticated than what was available in the Americas, but their numbers were so small that that difference would have been rather trivial. Anyone know what their biggest advantage was, according to Jared Diamond?
Germs and disease.
They were dirtier, is the way that he puts it, but that's absolutely right. Germs and disease. Charles Mann, who wrote a book called 1491 that was published a couple of years ago, estimates on the basis of his extensive studies that within a period of around 10 to 20 years of their first contact with Europeans, 90% of the population of the Western Hemisphere dropped dead as a result of the introduction of things like smallpox, various flus, measles, and so on and so forth, all of which Europeans had developed extensive resistance to by virtue of the fact that they'd been long exposed to them. And they'd been long exposed to them because they were dirtier. They were dirtier in the sense that Europeans had large numbers of draft animals and lived in close proximity to those draft animals. Cows, pigs, horses, sheep, goats, and so on and so forth. And those draft animals also provided them with transportation, and transportation in particular into cities. And cities, since the time of the Roman Empire, had little in the way of hygienic infrastructure. In other words, no sewage systems, no sewage treatment facilities, and so on. Basically, the crap dropped where it dropped and stayed there. And that meant that throughout most of the Middle Ages, if you lived in a European city and you were walking around that city, you were literally walking knee-deep in shit. And as you can imagine, that's not a particularly hygienic environment. And indeed, demographic studies of European cities indicated that they were steadily losing populations as a result of the extent of disease and so on in those cities. And that the only reason that these cities didn't simply disappear is because the rural sector, the agrarian areas, the areas outside of cities, produced a steady inflow of populations to replenish those cities. Conditions in the countryside were much more hygienic than they were in the cities. The upshot of that is that Europeans had resistance to disease. And consequently, by the time that the third and fourth and fifth voyages by the Spanish reached the Americas, most of those societies were in chaos. And all the Europeans had to do was to mop up the chaos, to take advantage of the infighting, to seize those resources. And essentially, the Spanish in particular used their access to these resources basically to plunder the Western Hemisphere, to plunder it primarily of gold and silver. But they discovered very quickly the same thing that Frederick William had discovered. And that is that you can only plunder a region once. Once it's plundered, it's plundered. You can't plunder it again. And that means that after they've removed all of the gold and silver from the Inca Empire and the Aztec Empire and so on, they've tried to figure out other means of making use of this territory, and basically used that territory that they'd captured in the Western Hemisphere to solve their own domestic problems. And one of their most important domestic problems was that Spain and Portugal, and many of the other European countries as well, had a problem with their own nobility. In other words, their nobility was producing too many offspring, and they didn't know what to do with those offspring. In some regions of Europe, they divided the estates between the various offspring, so everyone would inherit a share of that. But that in turn turned those regions into very poor regions because the estates got smaller and smaller and smaller. And therefore, most of the regions of Europe insisted that only the oldest male descendant would inherit the entire estate to maintain the stability of those states. And that created a problem of what to do with the second and third son in the family. And generally throughout the Middle Ages, what emerged was a pattern in which the oldest would take over the estate, the second oldest would join a monastery, and in the monastery they weren't allowed to procreate, so that solved that problem. And subsequent kids would be sent on things like the Crusades, from which they hopefully would never return, and thus not cause any problems. But the Spanish and the Portuguese very quickly recognized that in the Western Hemisphere, they had the possibility of solving that problem by granting their nobles that didn't inherit estates, enormous estates in the Western Hemisphere, to set up plantations and to create a kind of a social or kind of a feudal system within the Western Hemisphere. And consequently, the societies of Latin America were transformed with an introduced European elite that gained control over local labor sources, in other words, the local population, and where the local population wasn't sufficient to work their plantations, they started to import slaves from Africa. And essentially that introduced European powers into the Western Hemisphere, and basically the modern states of Latin America and the Western Hemisphere to a large extent reflect the administrative zones that were established by the Spanish and the Portuguese within those regions of the Western Hemisphere. So colonialism introduced the nation-state system to Latin America. One of the things that's interesting in regard to that, however, is that in Latin America, states emerged in the drive for independence. And that drive for independence was essentially run by those elites that resented the governments of Portugal and Spain that were taxing all their trade with Great Britain and wanted to get rid of that. And therefore they ousted the Spanish and established states in those administrative zones. And those administrative zones formed the territorial boundaries of those states and continue for the most part to do so to this day. The interesting thing in regard to that is that what is the purpose of Latin American militaries then? In Europe, Latin militaries were first and foremost intended to create that territory and to maintain that territory and to protect that territory from outside competition. In Latin America, there have been a few skirmishes over territory, but very few. Those borders were recognized from the outset. So what was the purpose of militaries? Well, the purpose of militaries was, for the most part, to keep the lower classes in their place. In other words, to suppress domestic insurrections, not to protect the sovereignty of the state itself. And that, in turn, means that the militaries continue to be much more active in politics, and also to some extent explains why Latin America has been subject to military coups on a regular basis throughout the 20th century, and indeed, to some extent, even the 21st century. That explains Latin America. I would like to go on to talk about how the state system emerged in places like East Asia and Africa and the Middle East, and we will indeed do so. However, I'm cognizant of the fact that I did not give you a break, that we're now quarter an hour to 6, and that you're probably getting sick of hearing from me. And therefore, I will put things to rest at this point and leave that discussion for next week. And I promise that I will do my best not to fall further behind in our scheduled lectures. Thanks for your attention, and we'll see you all next week.
The red and the... Yeah, just